On Thursday, February 26th, mediators from the US and Iran met in the Swiss city of Geneva. The two sides were meeting for nuclear talks again. There had been previous talks in Oman on February 6th, but those with longer memories might recall multiple rounds of talks in the past. Going into the talks, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian projected an optimistic figure. Speaking on state television, he said, "We see a favourable outlook for the negotiations. Mr. Araghchi will be in Geneva tomorrow. We are continuing the process under the guidance of the Supreme Leader so that we can move beyond this neither war nor peace situation, which will make it easier for us to remove the obstacles of the Iranian economy." Coming out of the meeting, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi felt that the meeting had been productive, telling reporters, "We have made very good progress and entered into the elements of an agreement very seriously, both in the nuclear field and in the sanctions field." US President Donald Trump was less pleased with the progress, telling reporters on February 27th,
"I'm not happy with the fact that they're not willing to give us what we have to have, so I'm not thrilled with that. We'll see what happens. We're talking later. We'll have some additional talks today."
One day later, in conjunction with Israel, the US launched massive and sweeping strikes across the country. Missiles rained down across the capital as planes dropped bombs, hitting military sites and launchers. In the opening hours of the attack, President Trump addressed the nation.
"The United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated."
On the first day, one of the bombs dropped on Tehran hit the offices of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. On March 1st, his death was confirmed by a visibly upset anchor on state news.
و پیشقراول امت اسلامی حضرت امام خامنه ای با نوشیدن شهد گوارای شهادت در ماه مبارک رمضان.
Iran is in upheaval, and the future is still to be decided. According to President Trump's speech of February 28th, this is the time for the Iranian people.
"Stay sheltered. Don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations."
This week on the New Arab Voice, who is the opposition in Iran that could replace the regime? And what does the US want from its military actions? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to the New Arab Voice. The situation in Iran, and indeed across the Middle East, is in flux. Things are changing quickly. There is still a lot we don't know. We are unsure how long this will last. When it does end, we don't know who will be left. The bombing campaign has targeted military infrastructure in places like Kermanshah and Tabriz, and Iranian naval facilities in Konarak. There have also been multiple strikes in Tehran, targeting the Ministry of Intelligence and the presidential offices. Not everything that has been hit has been military. Homes and businesses have also been struck. Footage has revealed that a girls' school in the southern city of Minab has also been struck. On Sunday, March 1st, the head of public relations at the Ministry of Health claimed that, quote, about 180 young children had been killed. The nature of the strike is unclear, but of course represents a shocking development. At the time of writing, 787 people are reported to have been killed, although that number will inevitably be higher by the time you listen to this. We've also seen a series of targeted assassinations, similar to what was seen during the 12-day war back in June of 2025. Among the high-profile names to have been killed was Ali Shamkhani, the Secretary of Iran's Defense Council and a close advisor to Supreme Leader Khamenei. Until recently, he had been overseeing the negotiations between the US and Iran. Abdulrahim Mousavi, the Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces and the former Commander-in-Chief of the Iranian army, also killed, as was Aziz Nazir-Zadeh, the Minister of Defense. Mohammad Pakbour, the Commander-in-Chief of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, assassinated. And there were others. This list was correct at the time of writing, but given the way things are moving, by the time you hear this, other names would have likely been added. Of course, the most consequential name, by far, was Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. He had led the country as the highest-ranking religious figure in Iran's theocracy since 1989. As leader, and before under Supreme Leader Khamenei, he oversaw some of the most significant events and changes in the country. The 8-year-long war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and the original nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and he was instrumental in the creation of the Axis of Resistance, bringing together Hezbollah, former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, and the Shia militias in Iraq. But also as leader, Khamenei presided over brutal crackdowns against protesting Iranians. Most notably, in 2009, 2017 and 19, the Women Life Freedom Movement of 2022, which he blamed on foreign powers, and right up until the protests of December 2025 and January 2026. During these crackdowns, hundreds of thousands were jailed and tens of thousands were killed. As Supreme Leader of Iran, his power and influence was felt across the country and the wider Middle East. The killing of Ayatollah Khamenei is a genuine turning point in the history of Iran and the region. On Friday afternoon, February 27th, I spoke with Charles Dunne, a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. We discussed a number of issues, including what the US and Iran would be wanting from the nuclear talks, how the Trump administration views the regime in Iran, and whether or not the US would be launching strikes against Iran. Less than 24 hours later, much of what we spoke about paled into insignificance. It was clear that the US was done negotiating the nuclear issue, and given the abrupt about turn from negotiations to war, it appears as if this had been planned for a long time. Very kindly, Charles agreed to sit down with me again on Monday afternoon to try and make some sense of what happened over the weekend. We spoke on Friday. Today is Monday. Monday is not like Friday. I think it's fair to say things are very different than when we previously spoke. One of the things that, I've been sort of reading lots and watching lots over the weekend and listening to lots of things, and the general consensus of everybody is, I don't know, maybe, who knows? That's the sort of overall feeling, is everyone's a little unsure about what's exactly going to happen. Nevertheless, we will do our best. With the start of this US-Israeli military operation, President Trump pretty explicitly said this is about regime change. He truthed on his platform. This is effectively regime change. What is regime change, do we think, in the eyes of Donald Trump? Because I think we spoke on Friday about Venezuela. They removed Maduro. but left everything else. We've now seen the removal of Ayatollah Khamenei. Is that regime change, do we think, in the eyes of Trump?
Well, I don't think that's regime change. Um, I think President Trump has kind of a one-off view of these situations. We make a big dramatic splash with military action, and we leave everybody else to sort it out. In this case, the Iranian people, who he's called on to essentially take over the government. You won't have another chance for generations, he said. And that's a quote. How they're going to do that is another question. And I really do believe that the people with the most weapons are in the best position to take over the government. In this case, that would be the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and the people who help police the streets in revolutionary times, the besieged militia.
Okay.
I don't see a sudden democratic uprising overwhelming what's left of the regime. And what's left of the regime, by the way, is pretty substantial in terms of organization, arms, money, and political will. I don't believe that killing a few people at the top of the regime is actually going to fundamentally change Iran. But we're just going to have to see. Everything is up in the air, as you said.
Do you think that Trump would be content with, the IRGC and the besieged militias taking control?
I think he would be content with that if he's now looking at a weakened regime with dramatically scaled down ambitions for regional influence and one that he could work with in terms of deals, whether they're economic deals. This is something that the Iranians had apparently offered in negotiations before the United States and Israel struck, which is economic deals, mining deals, and so on. That would be dependent, of course, on lifting some of the sanctions, at least. I think Trump would be happy with that. There is nothing in his foreign policy or in his new national security strategy that suggests he's truly interested in representative government or democracy. And he's kind of made that clear in public statements and in his actions. But a regime that he can work with, do deals with, that would be ideal. And one that doesn't threaten U.S. interests or Israeli interests in the region.
The deal maker in chief at it again.
Indeed.
Let's say we understand that to be what Trump wants. Militarily speaking, I think, CENTCOM would have different objectives, obviously, to ultimately to what Donald Trump wants. What do we think those objectives are for the US military? And from what we've seen over the weekend, do we think they've been successful?
Right. Well, I mean, the CENTCOM objectives were spelled out in a statement by CENTCOM itself, which was very much focused on the Iranian nuclear program and the ballistic missile program and certain military targets, including the IRGC and so on. So they seem to have a more limited objective. They didn't speak at all about we're changing the regime, as the president has. So I don't think that amounts to a rift in the U.S. government thinking about this. CENTCOM is going to do what it's told to do. One thing it hasn't been told to do, of course, is send hundreds of thousands of troops into Iran to secure an actual regime change. And that I don't believe is on anybody's menu in Washington at this point. But the president has also spoken about these attacks taking another few weeks. I don't know because we don't have that much information on how many targets are left to hit. I think there are probably a few that haven't been struck. If you're really trying to destroy the Iranian nuclear program, and they're very hard targets, like the nuclear facility at Pickaxe Mountain, 1 mile north of the destroyed Natanz facility, which a lot of agencies think is the place where extra nuclear material has been housed, and it's deeply buried. I haven't seen anything indicating that that is on the target list. So there are big questions about, what is going to come next. I mean, Trump has been very clear about Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. but beyond that, even including that, let me put it this way, even including that, has this objective been achieved? And if there are any further objectives, how are you going to go about it?
Hmm.
And that, I think, is a big question right now.
I heard somebody describe it saying, considering there are no US troops on the ground currently, and it looks very unlikely there will be, it will effectively end up as a war between whose ammo runs out first. Between US missiles and drone attacks and the ability of the Iranians to fire their cruise missiles across the region and maybe shoot down planes and things. It seems like our best estimate of where this conflict is going is just who has the munitions to hold out for the longest. On that, I would probably give it to the Americans. I mean, ultimately, the biggest news over the weekend was the death of the Ayatollah. Mm-hmm. Were you surprised, firstly, that they did go for this? I mean, it seems like they had CIA intelligence, by all accounts, to find out where he is, and it seemed very accurate because he is gone now. And it sort of then begs the question, Iran's a big country. They're in the middle of a war. Who's in charge now?
Well, I would say, first of all, yes, I was surprised that they went so openly after regime targets. In the past, U.S. and Israel have definitely targeted, nuclear scientists, military officials, including in the IRGC and so on. And some of those targets they hit again, including the commander of the IRGC, who was also killed in the same strike, apparently, that killed Khamenei. I was a little surprised that they went so openly after the head of the regime, particularly because it's like, again, you take out the head of the regime, you hope to do what? Impose a power struggle that will leave the country much weaker, encourage a civilian uprising that will take over and bring representative government to Iran. It's very unclear. So I do think that we're in a situation now where we've created a certain amount of chaos, and the United States at least is watching its hands of what comes next, or really trying emphatically to influence the outcome. The Iranian system worked in the sense that they appointed a leadership council, including a senior cleric, I believe the president of Iran, and one or two other officials who will try to decide the future of the country, at least in the very short term. That's who's in charge right now, technically speaking. I would anticipate that the longer this goes on, the greater the power of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, will become, and the more influential they will become, because they really are the kingmakers in terms of deciding who they will support and how they will support them, because they have shown, a massive ability to help control the Iranian population. So that's going to be the key thing. There might be a power struggle, but I think the IRGC will mediate it.
In response to US-Israeli attacks, predictably, Iran has started firing off missiles around the region, particularly towards the Gulf. These have obviously impacted US allies, who seem pretty miffed about what is going on, frankly. I think particularly, as these Iranian missiles have hit civilian targets. So how supportive do we think the region is, I think maybe particularly the Gulf, is of Donald Trump's actions? Do we think maybe also that the Gulf has maybe been kept out of the loop and caught a bit off guard by this? We were only talking on Friday about deals and talks and avoiding action, and 2 days later, everything's different. So,
well, I think that the Gulf was largely kept off guard and out of the loop in certainly the details of the military planning and the scope of the operation. Saudi Arabia apparently played a double game, according to reports that I've seen in the press here. They were, on the one hand, kind of urging Washington to take a harder line and possibly military action, but at the same time, we're urging caution and following through on the negotiations that were going on. The rest of the Gulf states are, um, I think, somewhat shocked about what actually happened in terms of the Iranian reaction. And some of the leaders of the Gulf, especially the foreign ministers, have warned Iran not to take it too far, because then the Gulf states themselves, who have been heavily armed by the United States military, might take a more active role in what's going on right now. Um, I would have to describe their mood as basically one of, we don't know. We don't know what is coming next. We don't know what our role is going to be. We have to throw in with the United States because it's made this decision and it's doing this, and we're their allies. But we are very nervous about what the final outcome is going to be and how much instability is going to be unleashed uh, in the rest of the region. And forget about, Iran launching more missiles or whatever. Terrorism is relatively inexpensive, and they've demonstrated capacity for doing this and striking high value targets when they do. And that, I think, is really top of mind for a lot of the leadership in the Gulf.
In terms of being caught off guard, also, domestically speaking, now I'm no expert on US legislation, but as I understand it, a US president is supposed to go to Congress and the Senate if they want to declare war.
Right.
I don't remember Donald Trump doing that over the weekend. So are they going to have anything? Have they sort of said anything about this?
No, the War Powers Act, which is supposed to govern these things, has been moribund for decades. It was passed in the wake of the Vietnam conflict to give Congress some say in when the United States goes to war and what it must do to end conflict. A motion in, I believe, the U.S. House of Representatives to try to approve or disapprove action against Iran before the action actually took place, just about a week ago, was ultimately very closely, but ultimately defeated in the House of Representatives. So the War Powers Act was not invoked in the case of Iran. And President Trump, of course, conceives of having a very broad mandate to exercise executive power, and he believes that this war power is totally within his remit. I think, depending on how long this goes on, you will get more pushback from even Republican members of Congress, especially in the Senate, where you have people like Rand Paul, who don't approve of these large-scale destabilizing operations, certainly in the Middle East, but in other countries as well. And you'll get some blowback from President Trump's base, but they have demonstrated a capacity to really get over anything, even things that are supposed to be red lines for them. This is especially true of foreign adventurism, foreign wars, which President Trump has, certainly unleashed several of in just his, year and whatever, 2 months in office. So that's definitely something to be watched. It's relatively quiescent right here in Washington, but I believe that the temperature will start to rise if this, continues, and you see more military engagements by Iran with the Gulf, Iran with Israel, with other countries involved.
Once again, Charles, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Maybe we'll have to talk again in another 72 hours when everything's different once more. But who knows?
Exactly right.
While things on the ground are still developing and are likely to change further, one thing is certain. With the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran is going to need a new leader. There are a few possibilities. Firstly, the regime could survive, and a new theocratic leader is chosen. That business is actually underway. A new interim leadership council has been announced, consisting of President Masoud Pezeshkian, Judiciary Chief Gholam Hossein Mohseni Aya, and Ayatollah Ali Reza Arafi, an Islamic scholar from the Guardian Council. But a supreme leader needs to be chosen by the Assembly of Experts of the Leadership. It's a long process of selection, vetting, and voting. Currently, it's unclear how such a process could take place in the current circumstances. A second leadership option in Iran? We could see the military take full control, and the country is ruled by a general or the like, similar to what we saw in Egypt when Sisi took control. Thirdly, someone from inside the country could take power, an individual perhaps from civil society or a labour group who has an established base of popularity. And finally, we could see an individual or group of people from the Iranian diaspora currently living abroad return and take control of the country. These are not the only options, but they are some of the more likely scenarios. Let's start with inside Iran.
But inside of Iran, historically, the regime has gone out of its way to make sure you don't have anything that looks like a political party with an agenda and a capacity to push through an agenda.
This is Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute. I spoke with Alex on Friday, before the US and Israel launched their military attacks and before the killing of Khamenei.
So party politics doesn't really exist in the Islamic Republic. What you have is networks of people usually clustered around individuals. You know, the closest thing Iran came to a party political system where you have the so-called hardline establishment being confronted by some new group that emerged from within the regime, but a slightly different political agenda, was the so-called reform movement of the late 1990s and somewhere into the 2000s with Mohammad Khatami's election in 97. They succeeded briefly for a number of years, but the deep state, the hardliners, Khamenei himself, the Revolutionary Guards, they stifled them to a point that they essentially became irrelevant.
These reformist-minded politicians still exist in Iran today.
They haven't gone anywhere. They're still inside of Iran. Many of them are actually in the, say, Masoud Pezeshkian government, but they're in the lower levels of the system. They're rank and file of the regime. They're not the key decision makers. The question is, would they decide that this is the moment for them to actually speak up? Because for a number of years, they haven't spoken up. If they do speak up, if they decide, for example, to rally around some new figure or an existing figure, someone like former President Rouhani, who has at times made a case for example, the need for a referendum to decide the politics of the place, then you can see the beginning of something that looks like organized opposition from within the country.
Currently, no one is stepping up and speaking out. It would be a bold move, and not one that is free of risk. Even without Khamenei, the regime exists. He was the head of the regime, but not the regime itself. That is a far larger instrument.
It's very easy for the security forces to come and pick you up and call you essentially a traitor and take you away. So we haven't reached that point yet, but there is absolutely no doubt that even within the regime, you have plenty of folks who think this is a lost cause in many ways. The regime has lost its way.
There are a number of repressive regimes around the world, but Iran is slightly unique in the fact that there is no official political opposition, not even a heavily repressed and marginalized political opposition. There are those opposed to the regime, but they are not within an official opposition structure. This means that effectively there isn't any opposition with any genuine experience of running a government, repressive or not. There is a possibility that the next leaders of Iran could include parts of the old.
There's a recognition that you need people who know how to run the state machinery. So there is a recognition that unless you have blood on your hands, unless you've occupied a senior position in this regime, in the Islamic Republic, then, and you're obviously Iranian, this is Iran for all Iranians. There needs to be created off-ramp opportunities for rank and file of the regime to get off this regime ship and join the opposition, if you will. But obviously, for that to also be realistically acceptable to the opposition is, yes, you can, last and move into the new era, but you have to agree to fundamental changes.
As much as a change of personnel is needed, it is the philosophy of the government that needs to change.
The Islamic Republic needs to go as a concept. The idea that probably all Iranians, well, I shouldn't say all Iranians, but a clear majority, 80-90% of Iranians seem to want, and this is not scientific, this is anecdotal, but it's a separation of state and mosque, if you will. So separate religion from government. And if these people say in the Pezeshkian government accept that, you've already kind of seen the end of the Islamic Republic. They can then, in post-Islamic Republic, perform the sort of duties they can do as technocrats, running the state machinery. We're talking about providing basic services. We're talking about running ministries, the basic, functions of a state.
After the office of the Supreme Leader, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, are probably the next most powerful institution in the country. Could they set themselves up as Iran's next leaders?
The idea that IRGC taking over would represent a military takeover, I think, is misreading what is going on in Iran. I would argue that the military, in the sense of the Revolutionary Guards, has been run in Iran hand in hand with Khamenei for at least since 2009, 2010. So this would not be a major turning point, because the regular Iranian military, the larger Artesh, the regular armed forces, they are a conscript or professional service. They're not politically engaged. And in fact, they probably have a lot more sympathy for the opposition and its demands than they have for the regime. So when we're talking about a military takeover in Iran, we're talking about IRGC going from operating in reality but not in name to maybe formalizing that. It's unlikely in a theocracy they can do that, because in a theocracy you still need a formal religious figure. It doesn't have to be as powerful as Khamenei, but you still need a cleric at the top for it to be a theocracy. There is this scenario that they get rid of theocracy entirely, IRGC takes over. That would represent a big political change, because we no longer talk about theocracy, but it doesn't necessarily mean the policies would change unless whoever is in the leadership of IRGC decides that for their own sake of survival, they need to adopt a new political mantra going forward.
If Iran was going to end the theocracy, it would be a fundamental shift. While the military has been a strong force and a near constant presence in the country for decades now, official military rule has never happened in Iran. It would be an entirely new experience for Iranians. Another possibility for the future of Iran is a diaspora group.
Iranian diaspora is a project that has been building up over a course of 47 years, if not more. I mean, some groups existed before 1979. The Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK was created in the 60s. It's still probably the most organized Iranian opposition group. It has money, it has access to play in Washington, into centers of power in Europe. They present themselves as a formidable alternative to the Islamic Republic.
The People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, or MEK, has been around for a long time and are no fans of the current regime. But there are issues with them.
They don't have popularity. They probably would have small percentage of Iranians in Iran supporting them, simply because they are a relic of the past. They don't seem to represent anything new. I mean, they're still an Islamist organization, and the country of Iran today is kind of over political Islam. Political Islam is not the solution. So anybody who speaks in terms of political Islam, like the MEK, is essentially not misreading the mood in Iran.
In December 2025 and into January 2026, Iranians once again came out onto the streets.
So the last round of protests sort of began end of December 2025. In fact, the folks that were out in the streets were a relatively small group of people in the sort of trading community, upset with the collapse of the Iranian currency, the rial. And they were out complaining about something very specific, namely the state of the economy and why the authorities just continue to fail to address some of these major economic concerns. But what happened within a few days is events started radically changing in the sense that it spilled over to a larger segment of society. In fact, in many ways, a record number of people, by some estimates, 1.5 million people came out, not in one place, but at 900 different locations over the course of a few weeks, and involving about 400 cities and towns, which in itself is pretty unprecedented.
These protests were well attended and widespread. It wasn't just the middle classes of Tehran, younger students, ethnic minorities, or rural workers in the countryside. It was everywhere, all at once. Faced with this, the regime panicked. The internet was shut off and the security forces were unleashed upon the streets.
We didn't know for over a week what was going on. Images only came out later, but what had happened was this sort of mass killing of, at the minimum, it seems 7,000, probably more. Again, so when I look at it from different angles, the trend of protest in Iran isn't a new thing. They're happening more frequently because of the state of the economy, because the regime doesn't listen to its own people. But this was essentially a wildfire of sorts, and the politics that was in the mix was much more about fundamentally a regime change, as opposed to kind of, if you go back to 2009, people were asking for reform being instituted. Nobody was asking for reform this time around. They were saying this regime cannot be reformed, has to go. And in that sense, it was very different.
During these protests, the calls against the regime and the Ayatollah were loud. As loud, from some protesters, were calls of support for one particular individual.
And what was also very interesting and perhaps new was the focus that many of the protesters, not all, but a clear number of them, had chants in favor of Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who did, on his part, sitting in the United States, urge people to come to the streets.
Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is the eldest son of the former Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Born in 1960, he moved to the US in 1978, aged just 17, to train as a pilot. The following year, his father and the monarchy would be overthrown by the Iranian Revolution, which paved the way for the Islamic Republic and Ayatollah Khamenei. Since then, he has lived in exile as the Shah of Iran and been a constant voice against the regime. In recent years, he has become increasingly vocal.
This regime is collapsing. The people are more and more ready to intervene. This is a historic chance, not just for the Iranian people, but also for the world, to guarantee that the main reason for a continued concern and threat will not be alleviated by means of negotiation. It will only finally come to terms by this regime no longer be there.
Crown Prince Pahlavi definitely is, in terms of being an inspirational leader, occupying that role right now for many Iranians. Of course, not all Iranians. We know for a fact a lot of people have questions about not only what he wants politically. There's the fear that, why replace the theocracy if he decided to have anything that looks like his father's rule, which, by the way, he has repeatedly said he's not attempting to do. That is not what he wants to do. But it's still a question mark out there, and a lot of people are unsure.
It's worth remembering that his father was not overthrown for no reason. During his time as Shah, tens of thousands of political opponents were held prisoner. Repression, torture, and bloodshed were all parts of his time in power. One particular protest in 1978 saw the security forces shoot and kill 64 civilians and injured a further 205. Iranians suffered economically, while him and his family hosted lavish and opulent parties.
He is essentially benefiting from a couple of things here. Your average Iranian today, about 70% of them were not born in 1979. They were born after 79. There is a sense of nostalgia about the period before 1979. A lot of it is legitimate. People did live much better lives before 1979 than they have done after 79. So that is not what Reza Pahlavi has done. That is what his father and grandfather done. He's benefiting from the family name, if you will. And that is, I think that's totally legitimate, but it's also a reflection of how dire the situation is for Iranians in Iran. They would grab onto almost anything at this point other than Ali Khamenei and his disastrous policies and his total reluctance to listen to its own people.
This interview was recorded the day before Khamenei died.
Ali Khamenei, we shouldn't forget, for 37 years, pretty much he has had ample of opportunity to change course. He has had so many opportunities to listen to his own people, but he's decided that he knows best, and he's brought the country to this point of a potential major war and maybe even the end of Iran as we know it. This is all on Ali Khamenei. So in that sense, anybody, I mean, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has a lot to offer, but anybody who had that kind of name recognition could play a role of an inspirational leader, because the Islamic Republic is so hated inside of the country, and anything essentially is better than what they have now.
Grand Prince Reza Pahlavi could be a viable leader. Maybe not a leader of the country and a new monarch, but as someone who can lead the country to a new democratic and inclusive future. But he is not without controversy. Some are wary of his reliance on foreign backing, and his 2023 trip to Israel and failure to speak out against Israeli airstrikes on Iran have been hotly debated. He's also said that Iran should normalize relations with Israel despite Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. Reza Pahlavi is controversial. He is also Iranian, as are the members of the MEK and the protesters who came out onto the streets at the beginning of the year, and also the members of the current regime.
There are different ways of looking at it, but one thing you got to anticipate or hope that they would do is to go into whatever political project with maximum awareness, discussion, and their eyes open, and not being naive about how quickly things can change. This is a regime that's been there for 47 years. It still has probably about 10, 15, 20% support. That runs into the millions. You can't just ignore them. They're not going to fly out of the country. So you have to think about how can you be inclusive? How can you create defections? I think some in the opposition are doing that. They're appealing to members of the security forces. They're appealing to the clergy, saying that the Islamic Republic has been a disaster for the reputation of Islam among Iranians, who today are the most secular people in the Middle East, which is very ironic that they've lived under theocracy for 47 years.
The airstrikes of the US and Israel are continuing today. And if President Trump's ruminating is to be believed, could continue for a number of weeks. With Iran launching missiles across the region and Israel now conducting ground operations in Lebanon, the next few weeks and months will be transformative for the region. When the US and Israel do decide to end their bombing campaign of Iran, the country will need a new leadership. Final words to Alex Vatanka.
The real lesson here in many ways should be for the members of the regime, because there might be a last opportunity to change course, where Iranians organically have a dialogue among themselves, and the regime, one way or another, disappears, if you will, or at least changes so much so that you can't call it Islamic Republic anymore, because that is on paper the most ideal situation, that it comes from within, obviously by working to the extent possible for diaspora outside, because the diaspora outside are also Iranians. They're not foreigners trying to dictate the future of Iran. Most of these people are Iranians who left in recent years, so they have a say at this. So you need to be inclusive overall, and you have to also accept the reality that it needs a lot of organization. You cannot just dream a future Iran that you want, and not work hard in terms of organization to bring it about. It means you just need to sit down and think thoroughly through the various aspects of what change would mean, find parties, people, networks, whatever resources to make it happen. I think, I understand the anger. I understand that people just want change tomorrow. But A, that's not realistic in terms of how quickly it can happen. And B, that means whatever time you have, you now have to prepare. If you're in the opposition outside, you prepare. You unify your voices. You go into this with your eyes open, and you do not let what happened in 79 happen again, which is go for democracy, end up with something entirely different.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar Al-Phil. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode shortly. Until then, don't forget to subscribe to get notified when a new episode drops. You can find the links in the show notes. You can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can also check out our social media accounts on Instagram and X, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.